Well, I think that universalism is something that makes Sustainable Development Goals unique. So in principle, they should be present everywhere, all the time, or that's how it should be, especially when important decisions are made. If I think my personal life, so for me personally, universalism implies, everything that has to do with my everyday choices, basically when it comes to food or clothing or travel, the way I commute, and also maybe at a more philosophical level, it also relates to the question how I relate with other people in the world. And if we want to take this to a larger scale and think of, for instance, about Finland as a country, the logic is the same. It's about sustainable and coherent policy choices, first of all. And here I would like to highlight that it's not the traditional development actors only, or those who are concerned with the environment that should be in charge of this, but it is something that everyone, every actor should somehow own. And in this regard, I think that political leaders are in key position because they should show the way. For instance, our parliament, because after all, they are the ones who will see that our legislation is in line with Sustainable Development Goals. And also, if you think about universalism, I hope that it would also change how Finland relates to the rest of the world. So it would have impact on our national politics, but also our international politics. So in the face of sustainable development and universalism, we are all developing countries. And not only aid donors, but we should see all those interconnected features of our decision making. For instance, if we still support fossil fuels and we claim that we are coherent and we are sustainable, that is not the case. So actually what we do may and might have negative impact on developing countries on a global level. Well, this is an interesting question because I think that the EU, since the beginning, if you think about, for instance, the Rio process, the EU has been very active in advocating sustainable development. However, I would also claim that the idea of sustainable development is not equally shared and owned all the EU member states or the EU institutions or policy sectors. For instance, there's a lot of evidence that, for instance, the common agricultural policy or EU's fisheries policies are quite controversial when it comes to sustainability. But then on the other hand, the EU has a treaty obligation to take into account development objectives, and basically that should be present in everything that EU does. But now I think that the important thing with Sustainable Development Goal and with the new agenda is that that might really provide the EU with concrete guidelines. So alone, the idea of taking account of doesn't really mean anything, but we have to really understand, what we are supposed to do, and if we are incoherent, how we should correct our behavior. So I think that SDGs, all 17 of them, would provide this kind of impartial tool for policy actors such as the EU. So let's take the example of SDG 2, to end hunger everywhere. So basically what that means is that we would have food security for all, everywhere, all year round. So people would have access and availability of food, but not only just food, but nutritious and adequate food. It's, I think, one of the key objectives if you look at the whole agenda, but it's also very difficult to achieve. I think there are at least, I could think, 5 conditions that should be in place. First of all, and maybe most urgently, we should tackle climate change, because we can already see the negative impact of climate change on those areas which are already most vulnerable. For instance, in Southern Africa, where also population is growing, so we have more people to feed. So tackle climate change is one thing. Then I think we should look critically how we trade and how we produce food in the world, because there is sufficient food, but it's not divided evenly. So I think with global trade also we can have impact on that. So we have to be careful how we trade, and also that we don't outcompete. For instance, the EU doesn't outcompete developing countries that are producing food to the international market. Then I think we of course have to always look at the issue of rights and, for instance, rights to land. Who can cultivate, who can buy land, and to which extent and where? And, for instance, what kind of possibilities local communities and what kind of control they have over their own natural resources. I think that is also absolutely key. And that takes us to the question of gender. Land ownership, right to inherit land, right to have education when it comes to agriculture, and how to increase productivity. If we think about that, majority of subsistence farmers are normally women in those countries. So we cannot really solve this problem without them. And maybe last point, which is very universal, we have to stop wasting food. And this also is a challenge for us in Finland, because we know that globally, I mean, there's 1/3 of food available wasted. And this is a problem at both ends, so up in the north or also in the south, where we don't get the produce quickly to the markets. And that's why we have these shortages. So this also only goes to show how complicated this equation is, but we have to be able to think about it holistically. That is absolutely a key question. I think that we need to get private sector on board, but also really and truly become part of the solution. And here I think we have to be very careful and precise what we imply, what we mean by this when we talk about private sector. In developing countries, I think it's very important that we enhance the local private sector, because we need more jobs, more decent jobs, we need more sustainable growth, and more possibilities to have different kind of livelihoods and secure them. Then at the same time we need more partnership between northern private sector and those who are establishing business in the south. So all kinds of new types of partnership with small scale businesses. Not only those huge corporations that come into your mind when you think about private sector. And perhaps my third point relates to those who are really those big players, for instance, in sectors like extractive industries, that those companies truly take global corporate social responsibility standards seriously. And I think that here the universalism means that we apply the same standard home and abroad, even though we are operating in contexts where such strict legislation is not in place. But if we are to fulfill sustainable development goals, that's absolutely necessary.